All right, I'm here with Missouri State Auditor Scott Fitzpatrick. We're here talking about his newest financial report for the state. What are your concerns that you're finding, Scott?
Well, we looked at essentially the fiscal health of the state of Missouri and the primary fund that we use to build the state's budget. We call it the General Revenue Fund. And while we're coming off a period of 5 years of pretty significant revenue growth and spending growth in state government, that period is now coming to an end. This year, we're running a deficit. So we had a fund balance. We have money in the bank that can allow us to absorb that deficit for this year and potentially another deficit for next year if nothing changes. But if we allow things to continue on their current course, the year after next, which is fiscal year 2028, will be very difficult. Will essentially run into a brick wall financially where the state runs out of money and emergency action has to be taken. So we put this report out really to give policymakers and the legislature, as well as budget stakeholders like school districts and higher education institutions, Medicaid providers like hospitals and nursing homes, give them a sense of the financial situation for the state. The fact that we're running about a $2 billion deficit this year, we're going to end the year with a couple $1 billion in the bank, which means that we are going to have to correct our course and really realign revenues and expenses so that we're not spending more money than we're taking in. And we need to probably cut around $1.5 billion out of the budget next year to equalize revenues and expenses so that we don't run out of money in fiscal year 2028. So that's really the takeaway and what we found. And, I don't know if you have any follow-up to that, but those are the kind of the key takeaways.
Yeah, so just reading over the general statement here, the General Revenue Fund, which you alluded to earlier, reached about $6 billion by the end of fiscal year 2023, and that's what's been dropping over the years. So we got there, but what's changed?
Well, we had significant revenue growth for the period immediately following when COVID occurred. So we initially saw a decline that was followed by a significant recovery. A lot of that was due to federal stimulus spending that was kind of stimulating the economy. We also had organic revenue growth from just the condition of the state economy in general. And so we saw a lot of growth, like I said, 50%. I mean, the state budget grew 50% over 5 years, which is more than double CPI. CPI grew about 24% during that period of time. So when you have government growing twice as fast as the rest of the economy, that's not a sustainable path, right? So we're really looking at more return to normal now that revenue is not growing 10 and 15% per year over year. This is more of kind of a normal condition that we should expect. And what happened was, as that revenue grew, state spending was lagging behind a little bit. So there was money in the bank. Like you said, we got to almost $6 billion in the bank at the end of fiscal year 2023, which was a little over 2 years ago. And so the legislature began the process of spending that budget surplus down. They had that money in the bank, so they began investing it in different things. Some of it was one-time in nature, such as maintenance on state facilities or building buildings at higher education institutions, things of that nature. Other things were ongoing in nature. So increasing the budget to K through 12 schools, increasing the rates that we pay to state Medicaid providers for the services they provide. Those are things that, unless you reverse them later, those become permanent. Whereas building a building is a one-time expense and then it's over with, right? So a lot of those ongoing revenues that were funded with, in some ways, ongoing expenses that were funded with what in some cases were one-time revenues, are now going to become in tension with kind of the reality that revenue is not going to continue to grow at breakneck pace. And we're going to have to make some cuts to get expenses back in line with the revenues that we're going to have going forward.
So as you mentioned, by fiscal year 2028, we're going to start feeling that squeeze if course isn't corrected. How so?
Well, we will run out of money. We have, we started this year. So at the at the end of FY 2023, we had $5.8 billion in the bank. At the end of FY 24, we had $4.3 billion in the bank. And we're going to have about $2.3 billion in the bank at the end of this fiscal year. So that's we're burning off $3.5 billion of fund balance in the course of a few years. And that deficit has gotten wider. So we have to narrow it. And, because we had a couple of years of very big surplus, right? We had a couple of years where we brought in a lot more than we spent. And now we're spending more than we're taking in. And so we now need to bring those two things back in line with each other so that we can continue to operate and be fiscally healthy as a state.
So you said within like the next year's budget,
so
trim about $1.5 billion. Where could we
so we'll have, assuming revenues come in at the estimate that was agreed to by the governor and the legislature for the remainder of this year and then next year. And assuming that expenses remain flat at where they are projected to be this year. So if we have the same level of expenses next year as we are projecting we will have this year, and revenue comes in as expected, then we will spend $2 billion more than we take in this year, and we'll spend $1.5 billion more than we take in next year. Okay, so if we end this year with 2.3 billion and we spend 1.5 billion more than we take in next year, that means we would end next year with about 800 million in the bank. And then if we do that again the following year, then we would be out of money probably halfway through the year. So that gives you a sense of how long we have at our current revenue and spending pace. So anything we can do to slow down the spending in the upcoming budget year, the more we do now, the less painful it will be in the following year. Because number one, it'll extend our runway, right? Even if we have a deficit of some level, as long as it's smaller than $1.5 billion, we'll be doing ourselves a favor by making next year a little easier, right? I would advocate for going all the way to just balancing the budget this year and not continuing to burn the fund balance. That way we have a couple $2 billion that we're sitting on in the event of an emergency. Because another thing we haven't talked about is what happens if we have a recession. And the report goes into detail about what happens to state revenues during recessionary periods. And it's not pretty, right? It can change, things can change drastically very quickly. And if you don't have money in the bank to absorb some of those revenue shortfalls, then you have to basically enact emergency spending cuts immediately. And that gets very uncomfortable for everybody. The school districts and all these entities that rely on state money end up not getting as much money as they thought they were going to get that year. And then they have a problem, right? So we want to be proactive. And the reason we put this report out when we did is to try to encourage the legislature to take action now instead of waiting another year when we have no choice but to take action. Do it while we still have some discretion to make this a softer landing.
All right, I know you got to get out of here, but I got one more question for you. You mentioned, being proactive and your preferred method, just balancing the budget now. What could that look like?
Well, it'll be painful, but when you look at how much more money we're spending now than we were spending 5 years ago, I guess the nice thing about it is we're not coming off of a period of basically no growth and then saying, hey, guess what? You got to go cut $1 billion. We're coming off of a period where we've grown 50%. And now we're telling people, hey, we've got to pare that back a little bit. And so hopefully by giving these entities that receive the state appropriations, the state money, by giving them a little bit more warning, then they can start to go through exercises of their own of, hey, how do we cut our budget? How do we align our revenues and expenses if we get a 10% cut in funding from the state, or if we get a 5% cut in funding from the state? It gives them time so that they're not caught off guard in 6 months if the budget passes and they've been cut significantly, right? So in terms of what that looks like, I was once the budget chairman in the House of Representatives, and it was my job to decide where we cut money from. I was actually the budget chairman the last time we had to do a significant cutting exercise about 7 years ago. And it's not fun. It's not easy. But the people that are doing those jobs, I have full confidence in them that they can figure it out. So Dirk Deaton, the House budget chairman, Rusty Black, the Senate Appropriations chairman, and Governor Kehoe understand this problem and know that they've got work to do here. And so they're going to lead the charge, and they're going to lead the conversation on where that money comes from. My role here was to raise awareness about the problem and kind of the magnitude of the problem so that people understand why they're doing what they're doing and why they need to do it now instead of waiting. And they'll be the ones leading the conversation on what gets cut.
That's something we'll be looking into and following closely. Thank you for taking the time and directing our attention to this.
Hey, my pleasure, man.
All right, you take care.
You too.